been recently very aware of the pronunciation of names, so thank you to Ben for spelling out how to say Tom's surname. So Tom Sawczuk, PhD student at Leeds Beckett and sports scientist at Queen Ethelburgers, talking through the influence of sleep and match exposure on well-being in youth athletes. So over to you, Tom.
Yeah, cheers, Rob. Not many people get that right first time. So just moving forward from what Paddy and Sean have said, Sean set me up quite nicely in that we've spoken about what athletes do, and we've spoken about the fact that these train loads and match exposure can vary between weeks, and that they might be underprepared or overprepared for the matches that they participate in. But what we haven't yet spoken about is how they actually affect the youth athletes and how we can use this information to try and plan training programs and what other factors might be important. And to do that, we kind of need to look at the stress-recovery balance. So the stress-recovery balance basically explains how we react to any kind of stressor that we encounter. And obviously, within sport, it's mainly a physical stressor. As you can see, whenever we encounter a stress, performance decreases slightly. So if we have a match, it'll decrease. If we do any training session, it'll decrease. So we all know that because we all feel tired afterwards. However, if we get ourselves appropriate amounts of recovery, we'll then find that the performance improves to a certain point before it then reduces again because we're giving ourselves too much recovery. And you can see here that there's an element of too much recovery because over 4 cycles, the performance stays the same. And as athletes, or athlete coaches, we want to improve performance. So what you can do is you can shift that balance forwards and try and hit the peak of the graph, the peak of the curve, sorry, and you see there's a general trend upwards in performance. If you go too far, however, you hit the trough of the curve and you end up with a continually diminishing performance. And I think we all agree that we want to look more like Usain Bolt by getting our peak performance rather than end up with adverse outcomes like reduced performance, illness, or injury. But obviously this is dependent on us actually being able to measure maximal performance all the time, and that's not feasible, because every time we try and measure maximal performance, that acts as a stressor in itself. So what we can do is look at the symptoms through wellbeing questionnaires. And wellbeing questionnaires can vary, but there's a couple of examples that we've used. A really simple one is the PRS. And the PRS is just a 0 to 10, how recovered do you feel? The athletes answer using the words rather than numbers, and then we convert them to the numbers to get a figure out of it. One in more detail is a wellbeing questionnaire by McLean, and this gives us measures of fatigue, of stress, of muscle soreness, of mood, and of sleep quality. So this gives us a more overall opinion on how the athlete is feeling. And both of these questionnaires have been shown to be responsive to train load within adult athletes. However, if we look at the previous graph that we showed, we suggested that sleep is probably the best form of recovery that you can get. So it seems strange that sleep quality would be an outcome measure of the wellbeing questionnaire. And no study has actually considered train load and sleep and their impacts on sport-specific wellbeing questionnaires, so we did. We asked 48 youth athletes from a wide variety of sports to complete a wellbeing questionnaire every day. It provided details on the wellbeing scales that we've shown you, so the daily wellbeing and the PRS. They gave us the previous day's training load and match exposure, and also they gave us details on the previous night's sleep. So they told us how long they slept for in hours. We used a sleep quality measure from the wellbeing scale. So the wellbeing scale that we're going to show you now is a 4-item scale rather than the 5-item one that we showed you. And then we also looked at a sleep index. So the sleep index would be sleep duration times sleep quality, because we suggested that if you had 6 hours of good quality sleep, it's probably going to have less recovery than 9 hours of good quality sleep. And the results are really interesting. So on this graph, you want to look at the black and the red markers. And what you can see, the red marker is match stress, the black marker is train load. And essentially, match load seems to pretty much double the impact that the train load has on. And in this situation, match exposure simply means that there was a match on that day. So we took their whole daily train load. They might have had 2, 3, 1 session on the day, and we just coded it whether there was a match on that day. So they might have only reported a session of 60 minutes and hard, which would be 300 units. But if that was a match, it had a much greater impact than the train load itself. And we can also see that whilst train load affects the PRS, it doesn't necessarily affect the overall well-being score. And we attributed this to a masking effect. So you can see there's actually a really large impact of training load on muscle soreness. But it doesn't affect an athlete's mood, it doesn't affect an athlete's stress, and surprisingly, it doesn't really affect their fatigue. Okay? And it's interesting that this is the case because it suggests that other stresses may be more important to youth athletes than training load, be that academic stress, maybe social pressures. And it's something that's not yet fully been considered in the literature. We also looked at the sleep, and you can see that generally, sleep quality in red and sleep index in blue have a much larger effect on all of the well-being measures than sleep duration. And interestingly, the only measure that sleep doesn't respond to or doesn't affect is muscle soreness. So the well-being questionnaire, although not related to training load, does actually probably provide a full indicator of the athlete's well-being. What does this all mean? Essentially, what it means from what we've looked at is that sleep is more important to the athlete's well-being, and therefore our athletes are probably more under-recovered than overtrained. But we've got to remember that training and matches do still make the athletes sore, so we do still need to give them recovery, and that may still affect their performance either in training or in matches themselves. And we've got to consider the chicken and egg situation. If an athlete has to travel 45 minutes to Leeds from York, for example, for a training session, which is then an hour and a half, and then 45 minutes back, they lose 3 hours out of their day. If they've got an essay due in the next day, or if they've got some time they want to spend with their friends to recover in that way, that's 3 hours they've lost after they've already lost all of their school time. That doesn't take into account any time they might have to eat before or after, any shower or anything like that. So it has quite a big impact, and it's one thing that possibly we can consider to try and help alleviate the pressures they're under. Do they really need to go and do the training on a certain day? But now we want to look at how we can put it into practice, because there's no point in knowing all of this theory if you don't know how you could actually do it yourselves. And what we do is we use a wellbeing questionnaire, as we've said. And you can see here, this is an example of ours. So this is just the questionnaire we showed you before. And all the athletes do is they will fill out which one they feel. They're blinded to the numbers, so we convert it to the 1 to 5 number after that. They then give us the training loads that they have. So they tell us what session they've done, which is for our interest, and then they tell us the duration in minutes, and then they give us a descriptor for it. So for example, using the one I used before, a 60-minute session that was hard would be 60 multiplied by 5, so 300 units. And we'll add all of that up to give the daily training load. And then one thing that's relevant to before but hasn't been mentioned yet, we also asked them to provide self-reported illness symptoms. So self-reported illness is obviously a negative outcome measure from if they are looking like they're going to become overtrained. It's one that we want to avoid. So we asked them to provide details of whether they've actually feeling those feelings. And you can end up with a table like this. And what we've done is we've converted everything to Z-scores. So a Z-score basically takes into account the normal variance that an athlete may have. And we've color-coded it. So if it's going to have if it's a positive thing, it's in green. If it's negative, it's in red. And this is for plus or minus 1 Z-score. So 1 Z-score above your normal training load would be in red, but 1 Z-score above your normal sleep would be in green, because obviously that's a positive for you. And we want to look at these 3 areas where we've got two red markers for daily wellbeing and PRS. If you look at the first one, they're both in red, but neither the training load nor the sleep index suggests that it should be. So I'd consider that quite a strong warning sign. However, the bottom one, you can see there's actually the training load is very high and it was a match. So you expect the well-being to go down and that they're going to need a rest. So if we give them a recovery on the next day, you'd probably suggest that should spike back upwards. And the one in the middle is because the athlete's ill. And I think this is a really interesting way of looking at it, because what it shows is that we can measure when athletes might be at risk, but we can't always stop them from having negative outcomes if we don't catch it soon enough. So it's interesting to look at this, look at whether we expect the change to occur or not. But if you can't use a spreadsheet, you can look for the signs and symptoms. So from our research, we've identified that if the athletes are sore, they're training hard. Makes sense. If they're tired, they could be either training hard or they could be not sleeping well. And if they're moody or stressed, they might not be sleeping well, or they could just be teenagers. But what you've got to do is you've got to use that compared to their normal. There's no point comparing them between athletes, you've got to compare it within the athletes. And then you've got to consider the other factors. Are they feeling that way because of the training load itself or because of what's going on outside their lives? And then you can then work together to try and figure out how you can improve their well-being from that and obviously their performance on top of it. However, it's important to remember, if you don't stress your athlete, they're not going to improve. So we're not telling you to just not train your athletes. We're not telling you to always give them a rest. It's finding the right balance. If you don't find the right balance, they won't improve because they'll be resting too much. And thank you for speaking. Thank you to Ben and Kev for allowing me to speak.
Thanks, Tom. Just a quick question from me, and given you guys work in schools and there's a couple out there as well. Recent news story from a GPS provider that doesn't sponsor this event, so it won't be named, but are encouraging, obviously, a consumer device that's been manufactured and is going to potentially make the way into the hands of people who you guys are working with and has the potential to offer recommendations off the back of their activity that they may be doing in their own time. Is this something that is a good thing for you guys working in these kinds of schools who potentially have families with budget to splash the cash on this kind of stuff? Is it something that we need to worry about, or is it something that we need to encourage? Who's up first? Sean.
Nominated. I think, yeah, certainly, but at the same time, it's also important to understand how individuals react to train load, because it's very individualistic, whereas some athletes may. Is it sort of, it'll measure how much activity they're doing, to like total distance, that sort of thing? Yeah,
and potentially give recommendations off the back of it. So
yeah.
They're doing a kids game, five-a-side, and it may say on the back of that they should be doing X, Y, and Z. The system will tell them that.
Yeah, that would be really beneficial in terms of if you can grab that information and calculate and monitor it based off the athlete, because as I was saying, it could be athletes that can run a certain amount of distance and be absolutely fine, whereas if I did a training session and ran 3 kilometers, I'd probably need oxygen by the end of it. But it's knowing the player, but it'll definitely provide information that can be useful for coaches.
Just a couple of thoughts on it. I think some of it is providing the context to the player. So Nick spoke about it. You might have similar external outputs, and not knowing the actual context for that can make that a little bit hard to interpret. So I think education, so the players know what it actually is that they're looking about. But also, if you're just providing an external load measure and making recommendations off that, I think, as we kind of outlined at the start, there needs to be appreciation about what the dose of the actual training is and also the response. So what Tom's talking about is how they're actually coping with that load, to make recommendations about what's actually appropriate going forward, rather than just to focus on a number and say, oh yeah, this is what you do.
Yeah, so kind of adding to that, it'd be quite a good thing if the individuals then had to put how hard they found it or how it made them feel the next day, because then the algorithms could work a lot better in terms of understanding how they feel from it rather than just what they did.
Cool. We're a little bit pushed for time, so thank you very much, guys. And a round of applause.